Okay, in the final part of this week's course material on social selves, I'm going to discuss the notion of individualization. And to do this, I'm going to draw on some work that we looked at in the week on globalization and think about what that means a little bit more at the individual level. So we've looked throughout the course, from the weeks about Marx, Weber and Durkheim, and then the weeks about post-colonialism, and then the different sociological conceptualizations of globalization at the kind of massive social changes that have happened over the past, couple of centuries, and particularly in the week on globalization over the past, 4 or 5 decades. In that week, there was the work on, mentioned kind of in passing, on mixed society, liquid modernity, information age, and the network society. So these are kind of sociologists that are interested at kind of thinking of these large-scale kind of epochal era social changes. And many of those sociologists share quite similar ideas of how those kind of large-scale global changes affect people at the individual level, how that changes the way we think and feel and behave and be in the world, and therefore, how that maybe means that we're socialized in maybe different ways than previous generations. So, broadly speaking, and all those kind of sociologists have different kind of emphases and different terminologies to do this. There's a notion today that particularly in the Western world, that societies are more individualized. People think from a more individualistic perspective. There's more competition between individuals. But also it means that the kind of subject position, the way that people feel in the world, is more anxious and precarious. Some of these theorists then talk about the need that today we have to be reflexive about our own position in the world, and I'll go through to that in some detail in a minute. Now, in relation to what I was talking about with Foucault in the previous video, particularly the work of Ulrich Beck, asks us to think a little bit differently again about how science and knowledge and things like that affect our way of being in day-to-day life. So where Foucault saw us as being kind of disciplined through the freedoms that things like science and different discourses produce, the likes of Beck and some of the other theorists of what's called reflexive modernity in that sense argue that there's kind of, even though we kind of rely on these experts more and more, we kind of distrust them. So while we know we're in a kind of situation at the moment where science can shed light on kind of more aspects of our lives and, the environment and the universe and all this kind of stuff than ever before, from the kind of, tiny down to the atom molecular level to the kind of, what seems to be the infinite, infinite space of universes and galaxies. We have more information, we have more science and more knowledge about this kind of stuff, but at the same time we seem to be distrustful of that knowledge, skeptical of truth, kind of suffer from information overload. And for some of these sociologists, this creates this kind of anxious subject position. Now, the irony here, of course, is that, like, for many people in the West in particular, we're more physically safe than ever. Maslow's hierarchy of needs is kind of covered, the food, shelter kind of stuff, and obviously there's still huge inequalities, and we'll talk about that more throughout the course. But there's a kind of paradox here between that kind of idea that modernity would provide scientific progress and therefore more security and things like that, to this idea that we're more individualized, fearful, anxious, precarious than ever. So how can we sociologically account for that? So what I'll do now is talk a little bit about risk society that was also spoken about in passing in the previous lecture as well. What Ulrich Beck argues is that there's been a kind of progression of the way that humans understand what truth is. Now, again, I'm going to kind of overgeneralize here just to kind of move through it quite quickly. But where kind of pre-Enlightenment, pre-Industrial Revolution, truth was provided by things like religion, more kind of spiritual understandings of what truth is. After the Enlightenment, science became the thing that kind of rationally produced the way that we understand the world through the scientific method and things like that. What the likes of Beck argues today is that science still, for us, provides us with knowledge, but we're kind of now understanding that science doesn't necessarily produce truth, in inverted commas, because what science consistently does is come up with new truths about the same thing. So in this sense, kind of metaphorically here, I suppose, from this kind of risk society point of view, science isn't like done or contained in labs and test tubes. Really, science is done on the public. Because what we've come to discover is many of the scientific progressions around technologies and products and chemicals and everything that's been produced over the past couple of centuries. There's always, it seems to be, this collateral damage, these kind of unforeseen circumstances that come up, after they're released out in the public, that seem to create risks that we didn't know about at the time when they were invented or produced. So the example I use for this all the time, just to kind of illustrate this quickly, is asbestos, a thing produced, in one industry to build houses out of, and then, decades or whatever later, it's discovered it gives you asbestosis, gives you cancer. The truth of asbestos changed very quickly. This thing to efficiently produce, quite cheaply to put up to build walls out of, actually winds up killing people. And for, again, the risk society perspective, this examples like that basically pervade our day-to-day existence. And the media is particularly important here because it's constantly putting out, contradicting information about these things. So now on the news, there'll be a story about how red wine is, good for your blood circulation one night and then, gives you cancer or something the next night. Things around nutrition and, fitness constantly kind of seem to be contradicting each other. The HIIT workouts are really efficient, or do they increase the chances of heart attack? More larger scale things here is long-term larger scale is like the production of energy, material and products. These things that are kind of invented to make us feel comfortable and entertain us, and these technologically advanced things are also the things that seem to be creating environmental destruction and climate change. Huge scientific achievements, of knowledge, Einstein's theory of relativity, leads fairly directly to the creation of nuclear weapons. So science in this sense creates risk as much as it does truth or knowledge. Beck famously argues that what we're doing here, rather than where Marx talks about a class society, we now live in a risk society. While class inequalities still exist, class was largely contained in nation states. Beck argues now we need to think about inequality more globally, and that these large-scale risks that Beck talks about, things like nuclear fallout, climate change, smog, genetically modified food, pandemics, they kind of affect people across the class spectrum in ways that class can't necessarily account for. I have lots of problems with this perspective, and I'll talk about those in future weeks as well. The example, a kind of famous quip from Beck is smog is democratic. So what the example here attests to is that if you live in a global city and you are working in a huge multi-story building, but you're in the city, if you're the CEO in the top floor office or the cleaner that cleans that office, you're still breathing in the same smog. So again, that's an illustration of how these large-scale risks can sometimes escape class inequalities. And for Beck, there's also what he calls the boomerang effect. So while people possess wealth, everyone is afflicted by risks. And the ultimate irony in the end is if, the very humanity is under threat by these large-scale risks, they come back to kind of haunt and affect the people that produce them and benefit from them. So Beck argues that the kind of way of being in the world, the way of kind of feeling, has changed from need to anxiety. So rather than the main problems of society, and again this is largely a Western world analysis of being hungry and cold, is rather I'm anxious and afraid. So again, this kind of speaks to that kind of notion of precarity that these theorists are interested in. So again, it's not that risks haven't always existed. Wars, famine, natural disasters, disease, these things have always been around. But Beck argues that, scientific progression, modernity, has produced a situation where, first time in really human history, we could all be wiped out or humanity could end. nuclear weapons, climate change, and the likes are the things that he uses as example for this. So, when we're talking about the social selves on the more symbolic interactionist level, what do these large-scale kind of global, almost structural changes and phenomena mean? These sociologists tend to argue that we've gone through processes of what they call individualisation over the past, decades, probably up to, 40 or 50 years now. And what they mean by this is that in that Goffman-esque sense, where you're born into the world and you learn the scripts and you kind of then perform yourself according to those scripts, so if you're a white working class male, there's a certain script that you would then kind of follow and play out in the trajectory of your life. These scripts have been, in some ways, made more complex. Made more complex because of all those things I've just mentioned already around those kind of large macro scales, but also because of, political progress. So, something, for instance, an example that's changed is that in some ways women now have more freedom because you can go to into higher education more than ever before. 40 or 50 years ago, that choice wasn't available to women as much. And now I think, in Australia, I think more women go to higher education than men. So the scripts in that sense have changed. There's a little bit more freedom. But what this has kind of also meant is that in the way that we view the world and the way that we view our choices, when things go wrong, these kind of opening up of freedoms feel like we're to blame when things go wrong. So in the past, again, related to those more macro level things, where a setback in someone's life or for a particular group of people was kind of seen as being sent by nature or structure or God, a kind of blow of fate. Today, they're considered much more as kind of personal failures. The best example to think about this is something like unemployment. The way that unemployment is kind of represented in politics and in the media in particular is that if you're unemployed, it's pretty much your fault. You've made the wrong choices. You're lazy. You don't have the right qualifications and all these kind of individualistic notions of blame. But, there's basically hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people either unemployed or underemployed in society in Australia every week, but there's literally only tens of thousands of jobs available. There's a structural kind of disconnect here between the availability of jobs and the amount of underemployed and casualised labour forces. So there's a kind of disconnect happening here between the reality of situations and the blame. This relates to detraditionalisation at an individualised level as well. So again, this relates to those ties where things like family, locality, class and religion are less at the centre of those kind of socialisation processes. So Beck's quote here is now, how we live becomes the biographical solution of systemic contradictions. Day-to-day life problems, of which solutions used to be pursued in the realm of politics, community, church, are now left to the market, in inverted commas, and to be solved by the individual through choice, through further education, or whatever the individual has in terms of resources to be able to fix themselves and make themselves better. And we'll talk about aspects of that in future weeks when we look at notions of cultural capital, economic capital, and social capital. So blame for problems in one's life is increasingly left to the individual, regardless of the reality of the social problems and the extent of those things in the real world. So from this perspective, our way of being and feeling in the world, these theorists argue that we need to be reflexive. So reflexivity here emerges as individuals express and experience doubt at the expertise of expert knowledge and traditional forms of meaning and social organisation. We are now forced to weigh up the advice and knowledge from a plethora of experts, and this includes a kind of, politicians and media that tend to represent social problems as individual problems, and then make our own decisions to minimise risk. So these kind of absent, kind of established systems of meaning like religion that used to provide security have kind of disappeared a little bit out of the way that we think about ourselves. They haven't disappeared completely, but we're kind of faced with this looming threat of personal meaninglessness as we kind of search for forms of security, what Anthony Giddens calls ontological security. So this kind of notion of risk, this kind of collateral damage of scientific progress, produces this reflexive individual. It happens at an individual level where we need to kind of navigate our way through life, but it happens at a more global level as well, as kind of science and industry need to keep producing new solutions for the problems that they are causing. So in the book, we write a little bit about a kind of metaphor, kind of representation of this. It's like the idea of people being babushka dolls through to the tightrope walkers. And I won't kind of go into that in too much detail, other than the idea that this kind of relates to detraditionalization and individualization. And again, I can relate it a little bit back here to kind of those scripts that we need to kind of socialize with and learn from an early age. They're more complex now. So, the example we've got there is like the nuclear family model of a kind of heterosexual couple, fitted with kind of earlier models of full-time employment, where the man is the breadwinner while the woman would care for children in the role of the housewife. Now, it's been, social, economic, political progress that's not necessarily the case anymore. There's more accepted different forms of families. Women aren't just kind of stuck at home now in the workforce and in education. So there's been emancipatory kind of positive political progress there. The irony is here, though, is that, from a more functional perspective, as those scripts become more complex, there's more choice. It means those former roles that provided certainty now create a bit more anxiety and uncertainty as people have to navigate these things in different ways. So what's also important here is that as those kind of emancipatory freedoms have opened up, the economy hasn't adjusted as much to that. So while the economy tends to still assume that the nuclear family is the way that everyone lives, even though it's kind of, there's mixed families and single parent families and all kinds of different stuff going on. So the needs and kind of desires of people in terms of, having more access to the labour market and to education systems and consumption and all that kind of stuff, in one way provides more freedoms, but in the other way, the kind of lack of really clearly defined roles for people makes people more anxious and uncertain. Now, of course, what's also important to remember here is that while there has been emancipatory political progress for minority groups and people that are discriminated against in some ways, there's still lots of discrimination and marginalisation going on. So again, this kind of notion of meritocracy is also kind of something we're socialised with from an early age. If you make the right choices, you work hard, you'll get what you want. But really, the reality is that all those traditional contours of inequality, class, race and ethnicity, gender and sexuality, and all the other kind of things you can think of, still play real influential roles on people's life chances. So there's, again, a disconnect here between the kind of meritocratic discourses that dominate society and people's day-to-day experiences of them. From this kind of risk society perspective, this therefore then means that we're, reflexive and anxious and precarious and insecure. So this kind of then relates to the idea that maybe those kind of nested things of like the nuclear family fitting in with the economy and that kind of thing no longer apply as much, and we're more like kind of tightrope walkers or jugglers now, trying to hold together things that are contradictory and almost have to improvise the performance of our lives based on these kind of contradictory scripts. Okay, so in conclusion, note how this kind of reflexive idea and this kind of notion of being cross purposes resonates somewhat with the border crossing and mestiza consciousness that global South scholars have proposed. But it's really important here that there shouldn't be any false equivalence, because people in the global South, what we are calling the majority world, face much more stark and violent and material concerns than the more existential things that the reflexive modernity theorists are talking about in the West or the global North or the minority world. But I think it's valuable sociological conceptual analysis to think about how today we need to juggle multiple demands. We're told we're to live in this meritocratic world. We are freed somewhat from these traditional roles, but really we still experience the world through those kind of lenses of inequalities and those experiences, and these have profound effects on the way that we're socialized, and these mediate our life chances. And again, we'll go into those in some detail in future weeks. So, in many ways, structure has disappeared out of the explanations of day-to-day life, and particularly around social problems, such as unemployment, homelessness, ill health. Blame is always placed on the side of agency here. So, again, this is another reason I think we need to look beyond that binary and think about things and about power in more complex ways. Lauren Ballant, an American theorist who unfortunately passed away recently, argues that like this kind of contradictions that we experience, this pursuit of a good life and under the kind of realm of precarity, means that we're kind of stuck in what she calls cruel optimism, a kind of state and orientation to the world where a relation of cruel optimism exists when something that you desire is actually an obstacle to your flourishing. And again, we can kind of speak back here to Foucault's ideas of governing through freedom. You know, the need to be productive and healthy and good looking and cool and fashionable and all these kind of things. The pressures to do that could be some of the things that are the obstacles to our own flourishing. So in terms of our socialization, what I've kind of gone through this week is that the kind of more broad understandings of it, primary, tertiary, secondary, tertiary, the different kind of notions around dramaturgy and stuff like that. Unpack some of the notions around individualization and how power works, thinking a little bit about nature and nurture. What's kind of been missing, I think, a little bit from what I've been talking about this is the role of culture and media, which is what we'll be looking at next week. So much of the ways that we're exposed to things like expert discourses, things like, you know, information about whether chocolate's good or bad for you or whatever comes through the media. And so that will be the topic of next week's lecture material. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thanks.